They are, of course, conflicted in that what we are deciding has a direct bearing on their employment and matters very important to them. So whilst senior officers will take questions on questions of fact, for instance, the finances, they will, at a given point, retire to leave the rest of the meeting between the politicians. Right, the very first item of business is the minutes of the meeting of the 24th of May 2021, which are published on the website. Are members content that I will, after the meeting, sign those minutes as a correct and accurate record of the meeting? Could you please indicate? Fine, thank you, that's agreed. Apologies, I've introduced those members who are here. I have had apologies from Councillor Jerry Hyman and Councillor Peter Marriott. Declarations, has anybody got a declaration of interest to declare? I've not received anything prior to the meeting. I can see no indications, so we will pass to item 4.
Just to note, sorry, that like you said, all members of the senior management team declare an interest in respect to item 6, options for collaboration with Guildford Borough Council, in particular the HR implications, and they'll leave the meeting during consideration of that item. Okay, so that's a formal notice of what I've mentioned already, so that's fine, thank you. Questions from the public, have any been received? None received, Chairman. Thank you. And questions from members, have any of those been received? None received, Chairman. Okay, fine, thank you very much indeed. Let us go to the substantive item for this evening for us to consider, which is the options for collaboration with Guildford Borough Council. This was passed at the executive meeting of last week. It will come before the full council next week as a part of the executive minutes. The way in which I'm going to do this is ask Councillor Follows to present in the first instance, and then I will invite Martin Forbes to speak to his annex, which is within the papers, which was commissioned by the council, and then I will open it up for questions from members of the committee, questions of those people, and including Robin Taylor. Then Martin Forbes and Robin Taylor will then leave the meeting, and other senior officers who are joining us by Zoom. Robin Taylor is here in person. So, Leader, could I ask you to make an introduction, please, first? Thank you. Thank you, Chair. If I may ask if the slides could be presented at this point. Kimberly, thank you. Okay, if we could just go to the first slide. So thank you very much, Chair and members of Value for Money O&S. Most members here will have been present for a full member brief that we undertook for a couple of hours a couple of weeks ago now, before executive on the 22nd. It is my intent, with the Chair's consent, to very quickly go through some of the context of this business, to highlight a number of things that have changed since the executive and some documents that have now been produced and supplied by South East employers. My intent, if the Chair is content for me to do so, would be to hand over to the portfolio holder regarding the finances, and if necessary, Councillor Clark also in regards to risk, but I'll obviously be guided by you as to how much time we've got to do that. To very quickly introduce the reasons that we're doing this, obviously there is significant budget challenge that both Guildford Borough Council and Waverley Borough Council face, not just this year but over the next few years. I've tried to outline in the context slide some of the reasons that have brought us to the table. They are principally financial, but there are a number of issues that also do guide this, not least of all existential threats from local authorities such as Surrey, but also a need to share and, if possible, expand services for the residents that we all serve. There is a clear shared geography and history with Guildford Borough, and a shared economic sphere, especially in terms of transport and other infrastructure towards London, that make Guildford a suitable partner in those regards.
Now, obviously, the finances are the principal driver for this, but we also want to ensure that we have a vision beyond the financial and seek to deliver the services that we have now and potentially expand those where we are able to. I also want to take this opportunity to say that it is our intention absolutely to protect our staff. At the end of the day, our services are provided by our staff. And I would like to emphasise that the predominant focus of what we are proposing in our recommendation at this point is a focus on the Chief Executive and the senior management team, which is the reason that they'll be asked to leave the room later on. Both Guildford and Waverley have expressed the desire to maintain as many of our staff as possible, and the focus is only on that top tier at the moment. We also hope that together we might have a greater voice in the numerous pieces of business that impact both borough councils, particularly when in discussing with government items such as business rates, retention and planning, where speaking together may give us more weight. If the Chair is content for me to do so, I'd like to now hand over to Councillor Merriweather to précis the finances.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Paul, Kimberly. Thank you very much. Martin Forbes is going to speak straight after me, so I'm not going to preview what he's got to say, but I just wanted to raise a couple of points for now, simply because there are some things that we do need to understand in terms of comparing our two councils and translating the various terminology that we use and understanding the different timelines that we're on. So although Martin's report does draw out a lot of the similarities in terms of population, in terms of council tax base, it's important to understand that beneath the surface there are some important differences which we will need to start to understand as this project progresses. Can I have the next slide, please, Kimberly? All right, YouTube. Great. Okay, so the most obvious of these and most immediate is that despite our similar sizes, we have different budgets. Guildford is probably about a third larger than us in terms of gross spend. And beneath that, this slide just illustrates some of the differences that we have in our various operating models. Guildford has a much higher parking revenue. Parking is their largest single source of revenue. Our council tax bases are similar, but Guildford has a much larger property rental income stream than we do. They're much more advanced in terms of their property investment strategy than we are. So there are some underlying differences at the smaller end of the scale where Guildford has, for example, a crematorium. We have Waverley Training Services, both of those generating about £1 million of revenue each. Next slide, please, Kimberly. So as I said, what we need to do, what Martin has done is produced a report, but some of the terminology that's being used for comparison purposes means that we have to start to translate our terminology into a common terminology. So here on this slide, if you look at the Waverley Borough Council panel from the report on table 8, terms like net surface expenditure translates into the total expenditure, including pressures, but before measures that we all tried to get our heads around in Annex 1 to the budget papers that we looked at back in February 2021. The income line translates nicely to corporation council tax, retained business rates and new homes bonus, but it of course excludes our fees and charges. And then the net line is our net shortfall, again after pressures, but before the measures that we had looked at in our February 21 budget and approved. Could I have the next slide then, please?
Chair,
yep.
Possibly ask a question.
Yes.
The net service expenditure to me is actually net. It's because the total cost that we have is about 35 million, and we have some income which comes off it. So yes, surely that use of net is actually correct. That's not our gross expenditure. That is not total expenditure. It's total expenditure less some income.
That's correct, but it excludes the measures.
No, I appreciate that. I'm just saying that you've got your third line after the equal sign says total expenditure.
Yes.
And I don't think that's right. I think the total expenditure is a much higher number, but that number is arrived at after you've deducted certain income that we get.
Right. So the terminology I'm using here, if you go to our February budget pack and you're trying to compare like with like, the language that we use in our budget pack is total expenditure on that particular line item.
Fair enough. All I'm saying is I think you quite rightly said that we need to have a common financial terminology.
Yes.
And I think it's very important we make sure that we are using exactly accurate language.
Yes.
So, this is why I do point out, I think that word total has to be further qualified.
Okay, all right. So total net expenditure, including pressures, but before measures.
Okay, and then we hope that we can get the Guildford numbers on exactly the same basis.
Yes, with a similar cut-off, and I'll come to that as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Right, next slide, please, Kimberly. Very good. So in order to put the report together, what Martin's done is again, to get some sort of comparable. We have identified certain income streams in our measures and our additional measures, which is another terminology we used back in February, which for this purpose only Martin has classified in measures to be identified to get some comparison there. So when we look at Martin's report, the table there, with the green title WBC, which he's included as his benefits, doesn't include some of the items that we included in our measures and our measures to be identified. Can I have the next slide, please, Kimberly? So we have, not only do we have differences in terminology, but we have differences in cut-off and timeline. So most of you, all of you, I'm sure, will have noticed that the table in the Waverley Report 614 was an updated version of the table that's in Martin's report. We coordinated with Guildford in producing this report, and they asked us to put in some updated numbers because they are still going through some of the processes that we have already been through in terms of identifying measures to deal with the shortfall. So when you look at the Guildford measures, they exclude some work still in progress on a saving strategy which is beyond their future Guildford programme, and those are numbers which are still to be included in their measures. On the other side of that, the Guildford numbers include pressures which we've already assessed, and for various reasons we've concluded differently. An obvious one in there is, for example, the outcome of the review that's currently going on into waste collection. We have not yet determined, and I don't think we will determine, that we need to adjust our medium-term financial plan. Guildford have taken a different view on that and have included some numbers. So even though we are getting close, we are still not exactly comparing like with like, and a very important first step will be to make sure that we are comparing apples to apples. The most important point being that both Guildford and Waverley continue to work on our own standalone measures, which we will want to press ahead with, regardless of what comes out of the collaboration. Next slide, please, Kimberly. So just finally, we've talked about some of the comparables, and Martin's report does talk about staffing, property and third-party spend on standalone bases, but it's important to say that will not exclude analysis on areas where we do things very differently. We have different business models. We know that these things have been looked at before in terms of grounds maintenance and waste collection, but that will not preclude them being looked at again as part of this process. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Forbes, I wonder if I could bring you in, and can you hear me first of all? And
Chair, yeah.
And would you like to speak at this point?
Yeah, I wouldn't. There's not too much to add at this stage. I think obviously the questions are very important. I'll just say a minute or two on the approach we've taken. It's a very high-level piece of work that was done quickly. The motive was to give both councils a sense of the potential benefits, financial benefits that could come from increased collaboration, and we've done that by a desktop piece of work that, as you've seen from the report, looks at what's been achieved elsewhere, what indeed has been achieved by both councils in terms of savings over the last 10 years, what is planned to be saved, and then the potential additionality that comes and the synergies that come from combining. As has been described, we've looked at the three main areas which you would expect around staffing, around property and third-party spend, and we've identified where we can, not just the financial benefits, but also other benefits that could come from greater partnership working around resilience, around recruitment and retention, for example, and jointly working on common issues such as problems within leisure services and potentially around your asset base as well. So that's as much as I'd like to say, I think, Chair, at this point. I think obviously the questions are very important, and so if that's okay, I'll leave it there.
Martin, thank you very much indeed. That's fine. Right, I would just say that we have been joined by Councillor Hyman now, who I had got apologies for, but has now. Right, firstly, I'd like to go to questions. I think Councillor Hegan put in her questions beforehand. So, Councillor Hegan, would you like to go first and take us through your questions or deal with them? Thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. And Martin, I'm hoping you've seen the questions in advance, but for the benefit of others, I'd started by wanting more of an understanding on the evidence for the 5% savings assumption. You've commented that other district councils have moved forward assuming a minimum of 5%. Are those the 5 sets of councils listed in the introduction and Table 9, or have you looked at others? And has that 5% overall savings been achieved or exceeded? Chair, do you want me to list all my questions or let Martin answer them separately? So after that, I also want to look within the 5%, what assumptions were made about the likely savings in central services, because you've given quite a bit of information in Table 9 about the experiences there. What lessons can we learn from the experience of West Suffolk, where central service costs have increased by 28%, and what's been the impact of what looks like a rather large increase in cost on local services? I particularly would like to understand Table 7 and what conclusions were meant to draw from that. I looked at the net expenditure per dwelling based on the figures in Table 6 and found that Guildford Borough Council, this is a very crude measure, but their expenditure, and I understand these figures are different from the ones that Mark Merriweather just talked to us about, because these are the government summary of our net revenue expenditure in that table, but on that basis Guildford spends £400 per dwelling, Waverley £300 per dwelling, and all of the other councils that are listed there fall somewhere in between those two figures. So is it valid to draw a conclusion that Guildford has more scope for savings than Waverley, as it's starting from such a higher point in terms of its expenditure per dwelling? And I wanted as well to see how far you can go at this stage, if at all, in looking at the two major areas of potential benefit and commenting on how they might be apportioned between Guildford and Waverley. That's the 615,000 assumed saving in central costs in Table 11 and the 664,000 saving that's been suggested for the single management team in the final paragraph below that table. So those were
Okay, thank you, Joan. There are quite a large number of questions, Martin, but maybe you could take us through and give us your reply. Thank you.
Yes, no, definitely, and all excellent questions. I hadn't seen them in advance, so it may be that I just need prompting that I've missed some or not covered one in detail. So just please let me know in that case. I think in terms of conclusions, because a number of the questions are talking about conclusions, there's only one conclusion I would take from this report, because the report was done at a high level and its intention was to give a broad feel for what would be reasonable to expect as an aggregate saving. And there's certainly more work that would need to be done to get confidence around that number, but I think what I can say is that you're in the ballpark with the figure quoted there. So it gives, so relative to the budgets of both councils and the scale, so could you save 3 million, could you save 4 million, could you save 5 million? What the report is doing is bringing you back to say that number in there, the 1.4 million, based on and it's around staffing, and you can see how those numbers have drawn, is roughly in the achievable ballpark. It could be more, it could be less. I can go into why it could be more and it could be less, but it won't be multiples more. And that's the only thing really I would draw from the report, because what it has done with the best endeavours has been to look what's been achieved elsewhere, has been to look at what you've done in your respective savings programmes. But within the time and the limit of information that's available, it can only go so far. So I wouldn't be drawing any deeper conclusions than that from the report. In terms of the 5%, again, what you've got across the country is various partnerships that have started at various times and have developed. So East Suffolk and West Suffolk, they have merged in recent times, as the report talks about. But they were two district councils that have worked for quite a long time together and have evolved their partnerships and brought their management teams together over time. So where their costs have increased, again, we haven't been able to drill into or make inquiry as to why those numbers have increased. What we're doing is bringing to you in the report sort of the best information that's available on what's been done elsewhere. Other authorities are targeting 5%. They feel that where they've come, on the journey they've come with their savings programmes, with austerity, that they can make a further 5% saving in particular areas. So that's why we've primarily used that as a reference and as a basis for this saving number. So it's evidenceable. As part of the next stage piece of work, you may want to speak to those authorities and other authorities in the past that have gone into collaboration, and they may reference that they've saved more, or that they've saved less, or they've encountered difficulties. Again, it depends on the nature of the organisations and where you're measuring them from. Each year, as you'll be aware, you've been making significant savings each year. So even organisations that came together in 2019, that's 2 years ago. That's a long time in local government finance, particularly with what you as district councils have been going through and are going through now in terms of the changes to income and the impact of the pandemic. For that reason, I would say Table 7 is just purely for interest. It's a repetitive point that I'm making. We put up there a set of authorities that we think are probably the best comparators, but there's a lot of variables there, and when you're doing benchmarking, there's the old problem of apples and pears. You really have to get underneath the detail to draw any solid, genuine conclusions. And then in terms of the benefits and how they may be shared going forward, a number of ways to do it. We've made some reference in the implementation section of the report that other authorities have used the relative funding powers of their respective councils to do an apportionment. So that by funding powers, that's what government, when it's working out how much grants to give and how much business rates to retain, etc., your resource envelope, that's the funding power. So that's the basis on which the apportionment has been made in other savings programmes. Are there some questions or responses I've missed?
Thank you for that, but it's sort of left me still feeling a lack of evidence as opposed to ideas of where we might look for evidence. Is that fair?
I think the evidence is the best evidence available in the time that's achievable. So you're bringing in, you're drawing on what other authorities have done based on the published information, public information around cost base and benchmarks, and then the own information that both councils have been able to provide around their finances and savings programmes. So if you're to move forward, you would do a business case, and part of that business case would be about compiling further evidence to get further confidence over the savings figure that's achievable from the partnership. So it's an iterative piece of work.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I will throw it open now to other comments. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, we're trying to keep to factual points rather than getting to opinions or, if I may say, to the political elements of this. So, Councillor Mulliner.
Thank you, Chairman. A number of questions. Just quickly to Malcolm Forbes. When you use the phrase relative funding powers, is that broadly equivalent to your council tax base?
Is it broadly equivalent? That's a factor, but it also is bringing in your needs. So what are the demands, the spending requirements, the public service demands of an area.
So does that mean that your total expenditure is closer? A comparison of the two councils' total expenditure would be a closer measure of their relative funding powers in your terms?
I would say so, but then Guildford and Waverley are quite similar in that sense. If you're comparing councils in the south and the north, you would want to take in other factors. So there's additional grants that local authorities receive for particular issues and that need addressing or need support within that area.
Thank you. Right, I've got three principal questions, and I don't mind who answers them. The first is, I'm not clear what the envisaged timetable for this exercise is. We have a council meeting next Tuesday, but I'm not clear where the decisions that are perhaps going to be recommended then actually fit in. From what I've heard from Malcolm Forbes, there's quite a bit of additional work to be done, and from Mark Merriweather that we've got quite a bit of financial work to be done, both to get a common, if you like, financial template so we can compare like with like, and then I think, do we not need some form of officer validation of the savings that are actually achievable, and not just, as I think Malcolm Forbes has very fairly said, he's just giving a general guide, and the 1.4 million is a very high-level figure. So are we not going to need a stage where we actually examine the savings we think can be achieved? And I'm just wondering where that fits into the timetable.
Let me ask the leader to provide an answer then.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Mulliner. I would just bring members back to the recommendation that was actually passed by the Executive, which actually really just seeks to investigate that first stage with a single Chief Executive and shared management team. Part 2 of that recommendation effectively enables the discussion of and evaluation of any further areas of shared work and business cases for future collaboration. So actually part 3 of that recommendation authorises HR to do the first step of this process, i.e. the appointment of a shared chief executive. However, anything else further beyond that, as part 2 covers, would need to come back for further scrutiny in its own right. Now, the partnership proposals that we've put in foresee a joint scrutiny board of both councils, as well as a joint hiring and employment board to deal with some of these outside issues. But the decisions taken on full council next week are not supposed to do all of this all at once. It's merely the first stage and an enabler of the next bit, which does have full business cases for these things. So my advice would be, don't assume this is doing everything at once, because it's not intended to be, and it's not assumed to be.
Could I interject from the chair just for a moment on that, Leader? If I understand correctly, the proposition before us, the recommendation from the executive to full council, is to go ahead with the creation of a single management team and the appointment of a single joint chief executive. The actual choice of the chief executive would come back to full council for the ratification of the appointment. But is that not going ahead with the increased collaboration, bringing the councils together before a business case has actually been created? I mean, it talks about, the first part of the resolution talks about wanting additional data. It doesn't say anything about, and then having a successful business case, which would then justify the creation of a single management team and the appointment of a joint executive.
If I may, a couple of things on this. Firstly, just in terms of the hiring of any single chief executive, the constitution at Guildford requires a formal board that involves the principal opposition and other stakeholders to sit. Obviously, that's custom and practice at Waverley too, and so the intent would be to hold something to formulate a group that could fulfil those obligations in Guildford and in Waverley. That would make a recommendation to full council, which would appoint in terms of the process of the appointment of a single chief executive. The specific wording of part 2 of the recommendation, full council pursues the option of creating a single management team. They're comprised of statutory officers, head of paid service, chief finance officer, monitoring officer, directors and heads of services as the most appropriate means for bringing forward business cases for future collaboration. Now, my interpretation of this is that it is the executive's job, and in this case through South East Employers, to bring forward the details to support the business case for a shared management team. It would then be up to the new shared management team further down the line as the most appropriate group to formulate business cases for future collaboration, to do so and follow the due process at Guildford and Waverley to do that. So it's not, effectively, we have to do some level of partnership, i.e. in this case we've picked a modified version of one of the recommendations, i.e. to appoint a shared management team, but they will be responsible for bringing forward future business cases. We'd be putting the cart before the horse otherwise, in the opinion of the executive.
Okay, I'll return to that later in the meeting when we're in political session, if I can put it that way. Councillor Mulliner.
Yeah, I'd like to, I think I've now got the message, which is that, and it's a message that I'm surprised at. It seems that we're sort of taking the jump first and then getting the business case together, whereas I would have thought you'd do it the other way around. And this is why I was asking whether any of our officers, for example, have examined the bases on which local partnerships have reached their conclusion to see if they actually make sense using the facts as known to us. And a second, quite separate aspect, which Councillor Merriweather referred to, surely we have to do the work to compare the two councils' finances so we know exactly what we're comparing before we even know whether the whole thing's worth doing. So if I've gleaned correctly that council's being asked to take the first step before either of those pieces of work has been done, then I have to express my surprise and lack of support. The other important question I had, which goes beyond the timetable, is on page 11 of our pack, paragraph 4.3, where there's some slightly obscure terminology. I'd be very grateful if this could be clarified. What 4.3 actually says, it's headed single officer team. A single management team would be established early on to progress the full integration of the officer teams in both councils into one. Now, it seems to me there are three possible levels here. One is you have a joint chief executive, but you keep everyone else. A second is you have a joint chief executive and a single senior management team. Or, as this appears to contemplate, you integrate the entire officer teams into one, which would seem to me a great deal larger an exercise than anything we've heard about so far. So my first question is, could someone please clarify exactly what that first sentence means? And secondly, and this is made even less clear as it stands because of the reference in the third sentence. The objective would be to have one shared officer resource working for two separate democratic councils. Again, is this what is actually the ultimate objectives? Are we talking about, when I put it to the leader at the presentation, it looked to me like sort of perhaps 17 medium posts and 9 senior posts to get the savings, but this sounds a great deal more posts being amalgamated and therefore lost. And then right at the end of that paragraph, there is only then a reference to the comprehensive legal agreement. And as the cost sharing has to be agreed up front, again, I would be astonished if we're going to take a leap before we even know what the savings are, and let alone we know how they're going to be shared if they if they do in fact amount to enough to make this worthwhile. So while having recognised that other councils have merged, and I have no religious objections to it at all, I am very puzzled by the order of battle that we appear to be undertaking, and in particular getting the inter-authority agreement sorted out, at least in sort of heads of terms, would seem to me absolutely crucial and should be a matter which both councils want to look at before they decided whether there was anything in this for them at all.
I'll ask the leader to answer the question, but I would just say, can we get back after that to some of the factual questions?
Well, this is...
Yeah, but I think we're getting into some...
Well, no, this is simply trying to understand what the document says.
I believe I can answer factually, if that would help.
We're going to lose Martin Forbes at 8 o'clock, so any questions for him I would quite like to get into. Right, leader.
Thank you, Chair. Whilst it's interesting to speculate on other options that have been in the paper at some point, I'd bring people back to the most current, actually agreed resolution from the executive, which takes forward what is actually being proposed and starts with asking South East employers to provide for council the potential financial implications of appointing a shared joint chief executive and advise on the cost-sharing arrangements. So exactly the sorts of things that Councillor Mulliner has just elaborated are recommendation 1 of that executive decision. So in terms of the batting order, as Councillor Mulliner put it, it's quite clear. 1, 2, 3, in that order, assess the costs, bring it back to council. The shared management team, when appointed, will look at anything further. And recommendation 3 allows HR to implement that decision to seek a shared joint chief executive. There's no need to speculate on the other options. Recommendation that we have from executive is what has been put in front of you. So there's no, and I would also just caution also about causing any undue worry amongst our staff by postulating on things that aren't the recommendation. Thank you, Chair.
Again, I will want to return to that at a later point, if I may, please. Stephen, Councillor Muller, have you any particular questions that we can give to Mr. Forbes before he leaves us, and then I'll give the chance to other members to similarly...
I think he's made his position clear, and I'm grateful to him for the clarification. I think Councillor Hegan has also elucidated the important points.
Okay, can I just ask other members of the committee whether they have any specific questions for Mr. Forbes? Councillor Hyman.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I think that the stage that we're at the moment with the, where we're awaiting information to be, it's important that we really just look at the sort of high-level principles that are involved. My concerns here are partly the experience of members in particular. Ensuring that we have got the experience ourselves necessary to be able to follow this through. I don't know how many of our councillors have run their own businesses employing staff. Obviously, quite a lot will have been one-man bands at some point, and self-employed, I'm sure. South East employers, I'm sure, get their advice from good sources, but I'd like some sort of idea of how much, where the best advice is coming from in this that we're getting from South East employers, whether they are employees themselves or whether they are people who have got experience. Because if we're going to be relying heavily on that, we need to make sure that we've got the best advice coming in, because I doubt if many of our members, councillors, have got experience of hiring and firing and employing a lot of people and changing systems. I have, but I doubt if many people have. But I wouldn't be the only one, certainly. Councillor Molyneux's the issues that he's pointed out, I think everybody would share that we really don't want to be jumping into something until we've got all sufficient information in the first place. I haven't been able to find, and that's probably my fault, the figures for, I mean, if we were to be replacing the management teams completely with the new management team, and I don't know whether that's possible. This is where I particularly like SEE's advice in view of 2P rules and all the rest of it. If we were heading in a direction where we were going to be completely replacing the management teams and setting up a new management team, I don't know whether that's on the cards or not. Is it on the cards? Would it be allowable? And what would the savings be when we take into, how long would it take for savings to be realised if we were in a position where obviously we had to pay redundancies and whatever to virtually entire management teams that we have. And if we were taking on another team, how long would it take? Have we got those costs in front of us? That's what I would call the worst case scenario, so to speak, or even the best case scenario. But the extreme case scenario, what would the savings be? How long would it take to cover?
So, Councillor Ham, can I put words into your mouth and say, are you therefore satisfied with the level of data that we've got in front of us at the moment, or you're not satisfied and you'd expect to see more data? You're asking for more data and a business case?
I don't know. I don't know whether it's in front of me or not. Frankly, I haven't been able to make it. I've got obviously nothing really in the committee papers which turned up well in advance because they were, and the other stuff that I've seen, I haven't really been able to make sense of, and I can't look at my iPad now because it doesn't.
Let me ask the leader to reply on that point then, if I may. And then I'll ask Mr. Forbes whether he's got anything to add. So, Leader?
Thank you. Just to comment very, very briefly on experience. I'm the youngest member of the executive, but even I have 10 years of corporate experience in bodies significantly larger.
Self-employment, actually employing people yourself.
If I may, Councillor Hyman, the executive also has members who run their own businesses, both large and small. It includes people who've run large-scale M&As. It includes people who've run large-scale legal businesses. I mean, we're a fairly experienced bunch of people, but of course, we also rely on advice from external bodies. Now, South East Employers is a fully regulated group, an independent group. It is also, in this case, HR professionals from the local government and other spheres that are providing that advice. The very first question I asked of the individual that we're speaking to at South East Employers was actually her credentials, and thankfully, because she's a professional person, she was pleased to answer that question, because that's what we should be asking when we meet new people and ask for advice. And that's certainly what I do every time I meet a new person who is supposed to be giving us independent advice. So I'm happy to give as much reassurance as possible on these things. This also, in many similarities to another matter, effectively O&S is asking us to provide the due diligence that we are trying to commission with this Act. And so much of what you need to see isn't here yet, because that's what we're trying to do to get to the point where you can be in that position to be comfortable about this. Now, there was a supplementary paper submitted on ModGov today, which is for full council on the 6th. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of it because it's exempt, and it's exempt because it relates to the cost of the Chief Executive of Waverley and the Managing Director of Guildford, to allow that initial comparison. I would refer members to that in the first instance. There are elements of this that I think we should probably save until the HR bit, Chair. But the initial sorts of scales of the cost savings and the cost of the action itself are now starting to become clear. It's our intention that this is clearer still by the time we get to council, which, by the way, is what the executive recommendation says we were trying to do, is to get, by the time we get to council, councillors to a position where they can feel more informed about taking the steps towards a shared chief executive and shared management team. My opinion is that the exec recommendation is quite clear in its stages, and that's what we're trying to fulfil at present.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Forbes, would you like to add anything to that?
No, there's nothing further to add. The only thing, helpful thing is just refer to the end of the report where we talk sort of staff reorganisations, restructures in general pay back between 1 and 2 years. That's a wide metric because, of course, it depends on organisational design, the specifics of people, etc. So that's the only helpful thing I could add to that, I think.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Forbes before he then disappears? Mr. Hyman.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, my questions were quite specific, and I haven't had answers to either of them. Unfortunately, it's probably the way I asked them, but I'd like to try again. I'll pick up the issue of people making the decisions themselves, actually employing the staff themselves, not managing things, doing things for somebody else, and therefore not really being responsible and ultimately responsible for the decisions.
Councillor Hyman, you've made that
with
point.
Mr. Forbes,
You've received an answer to that, if I may say.
I can confirm I have done that, and so have many members.
But the issue I was raising was amongst the actual, rather than just saying, oh yes, everybody's got experience of in corporate life. That's not what I'm talking about. It's self-employed life. It's totally different. But the issue with Mr. Forbes, if I may, is it feasible, is it allowed within the rules effectively to change the entire corporate teams? I mean, or is this something where what we are doing is we are being steered in the direction of choosing effectively from the people that we've got? I want to know, are we able to, and I'm talking about TUPE rules and employment rules in the situation that we're in, because I don't have experience of.
Let's have Mr. Taylor give us an answer on that, and I'll ask Mr. Forbes to comment afterwards.
Thank you, Chairman. I mean, the key point is not, with all due respect, is not the experience that councillors have. It's the experience that officers have and the advisors who are appointed, commissioned to provide specialist advice to officers in both Guildford and Waverley. So in terms of HR and employment advice, what you've got there is 2 in-house teams, one at Waverley, one at Guildford, and then specialist advice being commissioned from South East employers who are specialists in providing HR and employment advice within a local government context. They have senior level experience in that. That's exactly what they've been brought in to do. So in terms of answering that question about Councillor Hyman seeking reassurance that we have the skills or will seek the skills, I think it's a factual answer to say that we have, and where we need additional specialist skills, those will be sought, and as you can see from these papers, have already been sought and will continue to be sought if this goes ahead.
I think it's true to say that if members decide that the 2 councils should collaborate in this way, then that is an entirely legal process, and many other councils have done that around the country. Mr. Forbes, do you want to make any comment?
No, nothing to add to what's been said. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. I'm going to release Mr. Forbes now, unless anybody has a further question for him.
Chairman, Councillor Gray has his hand up with your indulgence.
Okay. Councillor Gray, would you like to come in?
Yes, just a quick question before Councillor Forbes goes, and it's really to do with these central management savings. There is an estimate in there, and I expect that they are estimates. But what we haven't seen is we haven't seen any sensitivity to those numbers, the highs and the lows. And there must be risks in this, and we have an attachment which has all the risks identified in words, but not necessarily in value. And I was wondering whether he felt that some key officers to protect us against loss may have to have some form of retention bonus. I mean, going back to Councillor Hyman, I've operated in large organisations as a manager and an employee, and it's normal when you're having a complex change like this to make sure you lose the people that are no longer going to be with you when you want, not necessarily when they want. So I wonder if you could respond to that. Thank you for letting me the question.
Thank you, Councillor Gregg. Mr. Forbes, would you like to answer first before you disappear?
Yes, it's a genuine risk, one of a number of risks, and it will need taken into account without a doubt in terms of the context of recruitment, the local government employment market. Yes, I think that's all. I acknowledge that point. When you move to the next stage, that needs to be on a risk register and thought about in terms of how it's going to be managed.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Taylor?
It's not on the substance of that point, thank you, Chairman. It's just to make the procedural point that with all respect to Councillor Gray, unfortunately under the rules at the moment, Councillor Gray is not able to be marked as being present in the meeting.
He's not a member of this committee, and he's speaking as an ordinary member.
Just seeking to clarify the way that will be recorded in the notes, as it is something new for us all.
Okay, thank you. But I am allowing members to ask questions. They're not taking part in the general debate. The leader, and then Councillor Merriweather.
I think the point I'll just quickly make is for members who are able to refer to the exempt annex for full council, I think that gives some sensitivities as the sorts of issues that we will have to deal with in regards to the senior staff. I think the other point I would make is that in many of those cases, we'd be probably seeking to capitalise some of those costs once we had had a discussion with Guildford how we apportion costs and benefits, which would need to happen before we go any further. It's the sort of information that recommendation 1 of the executive resolution wants to make clear before we get to full council, that we need that information, which is what we're doing with South East employers.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Merriweather.
Thank you, Chair. I'm conscious and slightly concerned that we're drifting a little bit away from what the resolution passed actually says, which is that we will, I'm going to press it now, we will commission research. We'll analyse that research, and subject to the outcome of that process, we'll proceed if the outcome points in the right direction. What I've heard is a lot of sort of speculation about not only what this particular phase might produce, but what all of the other options that we've already ruled out might sort of produce. So I just think it might be better to focus on scrutinising what's actually in front of us.
Thank you. Again, I will return to that point later in the meeting, if I may. I'm going to allow Mr. Forbes to depart now. I said I would release him by 8 o'clock. So, Martin, thank you very much for joining us. We greatly appreciate your time.
Thank you, Chair. That's very much appreciated. Thank you. See you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Right. Any other questions before I then release the management team? Peter Vickers or Robin, is there anything that you want to add based upon the discussion that we've had? Robin saying yes. I can't see whether Peter is saying yes.
No, Chair, not from me. Thank you.
Okay, so it's just Robin.
Just a couple of factual points. Thank you, Chairman. So it was mentioned earlier about whether or not full council would need to agree the final appointment of a chief executive, and it is the case that they would for both councils. There were some references to the arrangements that would be put in place in terms of recruitment and selection, and the way that would work is that both councils would have to cooperate with each other in order to run that process, and that's what the resolution from the executive would allow to happen. But ultimately both councils would need separately for their full councils to agree who the chief executive was.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. In that case, I am going to pursue this question from the chair just a little more. What I'm concerned about is the second paragraph of the resolution, which says, and subject to the receipt of financial and cost-sharing data and advice from South East employers and any advice issued by the council's chief finance officer or his appointed deputy relating to the level of approval required, how any costs will be funded and the appropriateness of any cost-sharing agreement. We recommend to the full council that we pursue the single management team and that we pursue the appointment of a new joint chief executive. My question is this. In the second paragraph, it says, talks about receipt of various other data. In effect, are we, that will create a business case at some point. Will that business case come back to full council prior to going any further? Or do we all just simply have to wait until the appointment of the new chief executive? In other words, the reading, as I understand this, is that we are, as the full council, will be asked to agree that we will go to a single management team and we will appoint a new chief executive subject to our veto or otherwise of the actual appointment of the particular person. But we are agreeing to the post in this. subject to the receipt of further financial and cost-sharing data and advice. But that cost-sharing and that extra business information will be simply come to the executive for them to then say yes or no, or do we come back to full council? It's that which I'm seeking clarification of. Leader.
The intent is, and as far as I understand this particular resolution, is that information will be as available as possible for full council on the 6th. I've asked SSE, South East Employers myself, for that information sufficient for members to make that decision on the 6th.
So
and I would question that if there is other information that members would like requested, I asked that question at least 3 times in the members' briefing to ask if there was anything beyond that that members would wish to have.
Well, from my position is that I would like to see the full business case with all of the savings before we embark upon this process.
If I may ask a follow-up to you then, Chair, beyond the costs for any redundancy of the current Chief Executive here or Managing Director at Guildford and the costs of appointing a new third person, should that be the case, beyond how much that will cost in terms of redundancy costs, which by the way are in Annex 1 that's already been supplied by South East Employers, beyond the savings that would generate both in the first year and over the period in question, particularly the medium-term financial plan period, what beyond that would constitute a business case in regards to the VFM?
I'll allow Stephen Miller to come in at this point.
I mean, let me lay it out in words of one syllable. What this appears to do is by the 6th of July, 1 week from today, to have done all the exercises we've been talking about, an officer review of the costs, a reconfiguration of the common terminology, and that's absorbed by the full council.
No, that's not the case at all.
That's exactly. You're not proposing that. You're trying to leap into setting the council on this course before it even knows or could possibly know whether it's a good course to follow. That's the outrageous part of it. This should take at least 2 months of pretty hard work before a proper report can come to the council saying, we have looked at the business case, this is what we can see we can save. Now we recommend we go down this particular path. But if I've understood correctly, Leader, I'm sure you'll clarify this, you want the council to take the decision to go down the single management team and, it seems, get as far as identifying a single joint chief executive as a person, and the next stage is a council meeting at which council will be asked to basically approve that. And what extra information will any of us have had whether the whole project is a good idea or not? There seems to be a complete void. We've talked about this extra financial information. Our officers looking at the cost savings. Councillor Merriweather making sure that all the numbers mean the same thing when looking at both Guildford and Waverley. When is that exercise going to happen? When are we as council members going to be able to see the outcome of it?
Could I just interject and say, officers, are you content to continue at this point, or do you wish to withdraw at this point?
Chairman, if I could just make one comment, that the information, the supplementary information that was referred to in the executive resolutions has now been received and circulated.
That's with
respect, that is only one half of it. If you look at the first resolution, it says, ask South East Employers to provide, in time for the publication of 6th of July council agenda papers, which was today, additional data in respect of the potential financial implications, etc., and advice on cost-sharing arrangements. Where is that advice? I haven't got it. The piece of paper that I have refers purely to the first section. There are 2 distinct elements in what South East Employers are supposed to provide, and how they're going to give us advice on cost-sharing arrangements. We don't even know what the possible cost savings are. It beggars belief. I mean, we do not have the second limb of that advice. So I would have said that, in fact, you're in no position to go forward next Tuesday anyway, because the primary condition has not been met.
Okay, Leader?
Well, in the first instance, I would agree with that, because I actually did draft this particular resolution myself with officers, so I'm aware of what's required to fulfil it. And I would also agree that we haven't had all of the information yet from South East Employers. That if that does not come by the time we get to the full council on the 6th, then I will be the one pulling it, and so will Guildford, because actually without the information to make the decision, we can't do it. Now, what I would also just stress is that this is a staged process. We obviously need to make savings. I mean, the Budget Strategy Working Group sat a great many times and didn't come up with particular options for saving. And of course, inaction is not really an option here either. Now, pursuing a joint chief executive will save money. There's practically no way that won't be the case. There might be some short-term costs to enable it, but it will save money for both councils. Now, how that's apportioned, yes, we need to deal with that, and yes, we need to deal with it for full council. But that shared chief executive will then investigate further savings through shared management teams and then start to bring forward business cases on other areas where we might be able to save money. Now, to do it all at once, I mean, other than being mind-boggling, we could be sitting here 2 years and not saved any money whilst we wait for a hypothetical process to keep going. This is the first step, potentially of many, potentially the only one, depending on whether the business case supports that.
Okay, good. So, do you want to turn your mic off?
I'm so sorry.
So, now the position is a little different. So, if I understand this correctly, the resolution here that we're looking at is only dealing with the appointment of a new chief executive and the senior management team. There are identified savings of, I think, £677,000 in the report for those two things. Is that correct?
Well, it deals with just the chief executive, and as far as I'm concerned, the wording is actually very clear for all parts of the recommendation. It highlights what's required in order to bring the recommendation forward to council, and it highlights what happened if council decides to agree it.
Okay, so in a sense, so what I'm getting at, Leader, is that we're in a two-stage process. What you're asking for, and it's not clear from the resolution. The first stage is the appointment of a single management team and a new chief executive, where there will be savings which will be relatively easily quantifiable. I think the report talks about if you take two chief executives and take one out and you increase the pay of one by 10%, then there are extra savings. It's a fairly arithmetic exercise, and that's what gets you to the better part of £700,000. That's not too difficult to understand. If that's the business case for that particular operation, then I begin to understand it. But the whole purpose, as I understand it, of greater collaboration is that there are many more savings to be had. We've got a rough sizing of what that is from the report from the LGA, which talks about property and third-party savings, and other councils have done this, but it's top-level desk exercise. It's a hoped-for thing. There is no detail. So the only detail that council will have will be to support a shared senior management team, and that's all that was being asked for. The rest is hoped for, as I understand it.
If I may, Chair, we've asked SSE, so South East Employers, to provide for shared chief executive. Guildford has also asked that South East Employers provide a skeleton of the shared management team potentials as well. I think the other thing we don't want to prejudge here is how a shared chief exec actually structure the senior management team, because they may wish to change how that works in order to save costs or be more efficient. But the general premise of what you've described, Chair, in terms of this being a two-stage process with really the report from local partnerships articulating in broad terms what the potential in the future of other activities in terms of the partnership realm are. But in the first stages here, as you've correctly explained, this resolution merely seeks to agree the appointment of a shared chief executive, subject to the receipt of information that allows councillors to justify that decision, and then authorises council to pursue that appointment.
Okay, so we've had the first step of some data which was to be made available at the time of the publication of the papers, which is just about or almost there. But are we then, within the second paragraph within the resolution, subject to the receipt of financial and cost-saving data and so on and so forth, are we going to see substantially more data which amounts to a business case which will enable us to say yay or nay to the appointment of a single chief executive for both councils and the senior management team?
Well, again, it's just shared chief executive, not single management team. It just talks about the appointment of a shared chief executive. The rest comes from the appointment of that shared chief executive. But my understanding is that there will be information that outlines the costs of any redundancy, which you've had in the annex for full council, and there will be a reasonable assessment of the cost savings that would bring, and there will also be a probably quite high level understanding of what the share of the cost and benefit sharing between the two councils are. If you've got other things that you would consider that need to be added to a business case beyond those three things, may I request that this committee make that clear?
Forgive me, paragraph 2 of the resolution talks about the recommendation to full council that full council pursues the option of creating a single management team comprised of statutory officers, directors, heads of service, and so on and so forth. So, as I understand it, we are being asked to pursue a single management team and the appointment of a single joint chief executive, albeit that the actual appointment comes back to full council, that we can take that out for a moment, but we are here being asked at full council to go ahead with a joint chief executive and a single management team. That's what the resolution says.
And it's my very significant hope in that we've asked South East employers to do so, that the shared chief executive option is fully scoped and that there be an indication of savings on the shared management team side. I think it would be, other than the fact that we don't have quite the same structure as Guildford, so you're not quite comparing apples with apples on this, there would have to be some flexibility for a shared management team to be created by that new chief exec that is not comparable to the current one. They need the scope to pursue that.
Okay, but the real purpose of such a collaboration is not the saving from a chief executive or even the saving from a senior management team. The real golden apple is the collaboration yielding savings in properties, savings in third-party contracts, and so on and so forth, a whole host of things which we have only in my view, a vague understanding of. Would you accept that?
With respect, Chair, in the absence of other options presented by any other councillors, beggars can't be choosers, and we must pursue every angle that we can to save money, starting with the shared chief executive, but not limited to that. So realistically, I again ask councillors if there are other options of cost savings as opposed to cuts that you would like to present. The executive has always been willing to listen to those, but in the absence of those, we have to do this.
All right, Councillor Mullen.
Thank you. I think the obvious rejoinder is, first of all, we're in the second council year affected by the pandemic. And I, for one, would think that seeing how our income recovers and to what extent it does over the full council year would be a better position to know what our state of play is. The concern I have about these cost savings, and I will just repeat the fact that we still seem to be lacking the advice on cost sharing arrangements. Whether we'll get half or 40% or 35% of any savings remains to be seen. Clearly, the amounts which we are talking about, although noticeable, if we're talking about the £700,000 for the senior management team, and we got half of that, that would be around about £350,000. Is that enough to solve all our problems? I doubt it. And if it turns out that it's not possible, and this is why I was so keen we should see a proper exercise done on the other savings, the ones which could be even larger, but it's fair to say that local partnerships were quite cautious about putting too much weight on that number. And as I say, my understanding is that this council in particular, maybe not Guildford, has done a very good job over recent years of paring its costs. And that leads one to feel, how will the cost sharing work if one council has, shall we say, more scope for saving costs than the other? And I would see that Guildford is trying to save far more costs than we are. So I think the nature of the cost sharing arrangement is very important. And if you're talking only about senior management team savings of the order of 700,000, which, as you rightly say, is fairly easy to quantify, and you accept you may well have some first-year one-off costs which might, in fact, invalid or rather cancel out any savings in year one, but you'd hope to have year two and later savings, of course. Is that enough to justify what is a very substantial shake-up? And I've heard Councillor Follows mention this, Business Secretary couldn't come up with anything else without cutting services. So that is always an option, albeit a very unpalatable one. But nonetheless, I think we need to know what our new normal is in terms of our income as well as our costs. I know that a great deal of work has been done in the last year in actually trimming costs, and business transformation is an ongoing programme. So my other concern about this is that we're taking a very significant action which affects the council's nature before we have all the facts available. And I would not set my face against some sort of collaboration at all, but I would like to have far more data than we have. And in my opinion, for what it's worth, trying to do all this, it seems, within the next couple of months seems remarkably hasty. Thank you.
Councillor Merriweather, you wish to reply?
I agree with so much of what Councillor Mulliner says. I'm struggling to find out how we can come to different conclusions. We faced these issues even before COVID. COVID has only exaggerated them, made them a lot more worse, and these are things that we have to get on with sooner rather than later. The whole process here, the whole idea here is to gather the data and gather the research that we need, starting with a chief executive or a new chief executive, subject to the data that we're commissioning being supporting it, so that these questions can be answered, doing due diligence and doing research so that we make the right decisions. I think it's wishful thinking to think that collaboration alone can do everything that we need doing. I think which is why, as I said in my remarks, both councils are proceeding with their own standalone research into measures, which will still deliver savings regardless of whether we're able to do anything in terms of collaboration. So I just thought they were important points to be reminded of.
Thank you. Are there other members of the committee who would like to ask a question or make an observation? Councillor Davidson.
It's more of an observation rather than a question. It strikes me that we need to take some action, as our leader and our finance man has quite rightly pointed out. And it's a process which is going to take some time if we're going to bring around a change which brings the benefits which we need desperately to balance our books. A simple step of creating a single chief executive doesn't commit us any further down the line. It sets a pace for the future, but you don't have to go any further. And one thing I think we might like to recommend is that before we go any further, the changes which a future chief executive, if that's approved, any changes to the management team structure that he or she would like to see gets approved by our council.
Thank you. The other point that I would add to that is whether the way in which this is being brought to full council is appropriate. This is being brought to full council just in the form of confirmation of executive minutes. I would have thought better practice would be to have a specific debate with a specific motion to full council that could be debated in a proper manner, rather than having the restricted way in which an executive minute is answered with only 4 minutes, for instance, per speaker. I think that's not a very good way to bring it to full council.
Just to comment, in the same way that at the end of the briefing and at the end of the executive on another matter, it was my hope, and I hope members found it constructive, to open that up as much as the standing orders allowed. I will be making the request to the Mayor that I be allowed to pursue a more flexible variation of that debate at Council so that members can interact with it more fully, even though it is an executive part 2 minute, I believe, and would require speakers. So if the Mayor consents, that's certainly my intention.
Okay, so that would be an intent to have something approaching a full debate rather than simply an executive minute. So I would strongly commend that as an approach for the full council, and I think other members are nodding their heads. Okay, was there anything else you wanted to add to Councillor Davidson's points, Paul?
No, other than the fact that I think he's absolutely right. That's exactly it. At all points, you could decide to back out and go no further. The purpose of part 2 was that shared chief executive starts bringing forward those other business cases, which would of course be then subject to this scrutiny process as well. So you'd have the opportunity on a service by service or case by case basis to review any further aspects of the partnership that are being presented. In terms of reviewing and approving appointments of a management team below the chief executive, I'm not sure that's currently covered by the Constitution, so I'd need to refer that separately, but I'm happy to take that up.
Thank you. I would only reiterate my point that, I see there is little point in simply going for the appointment of a chief executive and a senior management team. The intent is surely to get far more than that. But we are going a step at a time. By the time you've appointed a new senior management team and a joint chief executive, it's pretty unlikely you're going to say no to the rest of the savings that would hopefully follow.
Assuming there are savings, of course.
Well,
that's the business case has to demonstrate it,
assuming there are savings, but I think I have to say that I would have been expecting, frankly, to see far more evidence and far more of a total business case rather than this a bit at a time approach with pretty limited time. I think this has been, in the words of the LGA of Mr. Forbes, this has been done at pace and a quick desktop exercise, which gives us some indications of the savings. Now, and what we're seeing here is a pretty swift. I think it's a fairly swift process, and I just feel there's a lack of data. Can I understand, in addition to the data that we've received today, you are clearly saying that you are intending to bring to full council more financial and cost-saving data? If so, when will we get that? Is it going to be the day before, or are members going to have several days to look at it and consider it?
I am doing my level best to ensure members get that before the weekend so that they can read it over the weekend. Obviously, I'm dealing with an independent body here and another council, so I'm getting it done as quickly as possible, but it is the hope that members will have it by close of play Friday.
Councillor Bisham.
Well, on a general point, we're in the really early stages of a massive undertaking, and I think we've got to tread very, very carefully. There's an immense amount of work to do, and we've got to make sure we do it properly and then get the detail in there. Otherwise, we can make mistakes early on, which we probably can't correct later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Nicholson.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, my points are, again, general points. I thought the Zoom briefing we had a few weeks ago was of particular interest, where both leaders' comments were considered, they were balanced, and they showed a grounded enthusiasm. I think that's just the right tone to proceed. Also, our chief executive comments were very good, very interesting. It shows that you must have continued joint political support. That's vital to succeed. I give the example of where things started well in one of the East Hampshire districts, and then one leader wasn't so sure whether to proceed, and then they were back on track again. So again, it's everyone batting together on this one. Now, if we proceed further, HR considerations are vital to protect the majority of staff who will continue, and also to provide fair treatment for those who leave. Obviously, there must be some templates because many districts have merged into unitaries over the years. And of course, there are also union agreements which must be honoured. And of course, we have South East employers who are heavily involved, so we have advice from them. And finally, I firmly believe we should appoint a chief executive from existing officers. I think there may well be morale problems otherwise. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There's a series of comments. Mr. Taylor, did you want to make an observation?
Chairman, I only just wanted to make sure that I and other senior officers fulfil our commitment to leaving at the appropriate moment. So we're all happy to stay, but I just want to confirm whether or not we're yet at the point where all the factual questions have been asked. I just want to make sure that I'm not sitting here at a point where actually we should have gone. So that's for you. I'm
very conscious that I should have probably released you at an earlier point, but I'm perfectly happy for you to disappear at this point, Mr. Taylor, and other members of the senior team, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Good evening, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Right, are there any other points that any member of the committee wishes to make? Councillor Mulliner and then Councillor Hegan.
No, I would take up Councillor Merriweather's reference a little earlier.
Could you bring your microphone?
I'm so sorry. Councillor Merriweather made the point that there was going to be further research to be commissioned. Could he possibly go into details as to what that research will cover?
Councillor Merriweather?
Yeah, I'd say pretty much everything.
I think you might be a bit more specific than that.
And how long will this everything take to get together?
Until we've done the preliminary research, this is classic chicken and egg, isn't it? The whole point of doing this step by step and breaking it down into bite-sized pieces is to do, I've forgotten your exact words, Councillor Blishen, but to take it step by step and not overreach at any particular stage. So at this stage, we believe that the path is to seek a joint chief executive who can then design himself the kind of a senior management team that he believes would work. It's not for, I don't think it's for councillors or members to tell him how to do his job, and for that team then to do all of the research and all the diligence into the various collaborations that will come out. And I just think it would be inappropriate of me to predetermine, prejudge, speculate on what that all might look like. We have a very high level analysis from local partnerships of the kind of things that can be looked at and what other councils have accomplished. I don't believe that analysis is exhaustive, but I think it does give us enough to say that we should investigate this further and pursue the opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hegan.
Thank you. I do have a concern in all of this that we are looking at something that is possibly a temporary situation, looking ahead to the potential for a larger unitary further down the line. And I think that has some corollaries. I don't think we can do nothing because something else might happen further down the line, because further down the line is frankly too far away. But I do think we need to be mindful that it may be a temporary situation, temporary being 3 to 5 years, maybe, rather than a forever situation. So among the corollaries of that is there an early opportunity to look at seizing more powers from Surrey if income can follow it, so we sort of try and merge into something that looks like a unitary. And secondly, I'd like to endorse Councillor Nicholson's point about retaining one of the two potential chief executives because of this potential that it's not a forever situation we're looking at.
Thank you. Leader, would you like to reply?
You'll appreciate I can't comment on particular appointments possibilities at this point, and I don't think anybody would expect me to. I will just comment on the Surrey bit. Without being flippant, there's probably nobody who would be keener on seizing powers from Surrey than I am. And so I have certainly investigated this a great deal with our officers in terms of the types of authority that could exist in Surrey. And the Surrey Leaders Group, which is comprised of all the 11 boroughs, during the process where Surrey was putting this forward, that action galvanised the Surrey Leaders Group into investigating a number of these different types of things, whether they be unitaries or combined authorities. Obviously, I think there is a part of this process which is also factoring in that potential existential threat from a single unitary authority. But there is also part of it that takes that from a different angle, where it's saying, well, actually, maybe we could be an alternative version to a Surrey single unitary by creating a smaller one down here with, say, us, Guildford, and with a third partner or even a fourth partner in the longer run. In terms of the phases that you're talking about, that we've been sort of referring to here, if phase 1 is a single chief executive and phase 2 is a single management team, well, an alternative unitary or combined authority to Surrey is probably phase 30 down there somewhere, something that I'm thinking about vaguely, but is not going to be something that we're dealing with in the short term, or even the medium term, I would argue.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hyman.
Thank you, Chairman. I absolutely agree with what Councillor Hegan has just said, and I very much agree with virtually everything that Councillor Mulliner has said throughout the evening. If I can just touch on a practical issue for a start, documents which might be coming out at the end of the week or whatever, I won't see those till Monday as it stands. Every time there's any, I sort of have a standing ordering because ModGov doesn't work on my iPad. Tried to get it fixed, doesn't. So can't access pink papers. So when these things come out, I try to have a standing order with committee services to have any pink papers emailed to me, and I do ask, but I can't really expect them to treat me specially or whatever, and they don't turn up. So I would like an absolute guarantee, please, that these documents will be emailed out to all members, because I know I'm not the only member who can't access ModGov. So I haven't seen, necessarily what's come out today. I don't know. I don't like the way this is being done. I must admit, if that's supporting what Councillor Molyneux's saying, I am very much in favour of what is being proposed, if done properly. I think it would be good. I think there is room for savings. I am very much in favour of that. But I do not like to be asked, and it's happening more and more often these days, it seems. I don't like to be asked for an in-principle support for something without sufficient information for me to be able to decide whether or not I do. And it's always down to the terms of the agreements. If done properly, now I've asked, as a matter of principle, and I brought this up at the briefing, the most important thing for us to be able to judge this properly is to ensure truthfulness from both parties, that there should be a duty of candour. As far as I'm concerned, anyone who says, no, I disagree with you on that, Councillor Hyman, we do not need truthfulness, we do not need to agree to a duty of candour. Why would anybody on earth disagree to that if they're an honest person? I simply cannot understand. I want this committee to demand that we have some form of duty of candour written into this, into the agreement, before we make any decisions, because I cannot see that we can have any power over another authority in the way that they act unless there is something in the constitution of both which is in some way actionable. You don't enter into agreements if other people can't be held responsible. I mean, and there has to be accountability. So that's the most important points to me. And if anybody wants to say, oh, we don't need truthfulness, if they don't agree with the concept of truthfulness, well, you signed up to it in the Nolan Principles. I don't know whether it's on the ones in the wall because I can't read them from where I am. But in the current version of the Nolan Principles, truthfulness is a principle which we were all signed up to. So anybody who disagrees with it actually shouldn't be here, and should stop making excuses. If there's any problem
Councillor
with
Hyman,
candour,
I think you've made your point. I think we have to accept that there is a degree of truthfulness, and if we're able to demonstrate that there is some lack of truthfulness in something that's being said, then by all means make that.
The issue is whether there is a system to be able to ensure that.
We've had this debate before.
Yeah, and you're going to argue against truthfulness. Lots of people do. Let me move on then,
I'm not arguing against truthfulness. I'm arguing about the way in which you're expressing it, and I think that's we've come up. We've had these debates before, and they've usually ended up in the same place. So can I suggest we move on?
Chairman, yes. Okay, well, we are here to represent residents' interests. I think that's why we're here. I don't know about others,
Councillor Hammond,
that's what I thought we were
repeatedly
here
said
for.
that, and we'd all agree with you in broad terms. So let's move on, please.
Residents, Chairman, are not always impressed by the advice that is given over many, many years in all councils. I'm not just talking about Waverley, but residents are not always impressed by officers and experts' advice. And what I'm asking for is to be able to ensure that the advice that we're getting is good advice. because unless we have a way of ensuring that, unless we are using the common sense and knowledge of residents and the expertise of residents who have been through, who have employed people themselves, not been a manager for a big firm or whatever, everybody's been a manager for a big firm at some point, people who have a particular experience and had responsibility for hiring and firing, taking on staff. If we're not going to be listening to that...
You've made that point before. I mean, we're getting into now the whole principles of local government, which is way beyond the sort of the remit here. And I do understand the points that you're making, but I think you're going far further in terms of that broad principles of management than this remit for tonight, for which we are relevant here. Leader, would you like to comment?
Yes, thank you. First off, I'm happy to agree to make sure that it's sent round to all members separate of ModGov. I think it's important that in this particular case that it's absolutely certain that all members have definitely received it and can have access to it as soon as it has been received from South East employers and been validated by our officers. So my hope is that that will be by close of play Friday, and it will be sent by email to all councillors, and I will clarify that with Democratic Services following the meeting.
One answer, Councillor Hammond.
In terms of good advice, to me, good advice is from qualified, competent people that are regulated by outside bodies, and in this case, who are independent of both councils. As far as I'm concerned, I'm getting that advice, and so are the executives of both Guildford and Waverley, and Guildford's leader as well. So from my point of view, I am not in a position to contradict advice from a source that meets those criteria. In terms of objective truth, I won't stray too far down into that, but I'm subject to the code of conduct, and so are you. I don't necessarily assume everybody's lying to me until proven otherwise. Staff are subject to their staff agreements, and where there is validation of points made by members of the executive or others that require validation, that's the purpose of a scrutiny committee, which we're here today, and that's its function. So from my point of view, the evidence that you're being asked to consider to agree is established in point 1 of the resolution, and any further decisions of council are subject to the receipt and agreement of that information in part 1.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Davidson and then Councillor Hegan.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know whether I'm jumping the gun or going back over too much old ground. A couple of, three points I think I got here. Following up from what Councillor Gray mentioned earlier on, it would be nice if we had some idea on the strategic risk analysis as to the likelihood and possible impact of the risks being realized. It's descriptive, but it's not really sufficiently factual, to my mind. Looking at the CEO recruitment, an observation, I think legally we have to make the advertise the appointment openly, and as such we cannot constrain it in any way. We may have our own preferences, but we should not use those preferences to be the decision in terms of the choice of a future chief executive. A request, if I may, is would it be at all possible to have clarity on a roadmap? I think you know, from what Councillor Mulligan has been saying, what Stephen has been saying, Councillor Mulligan has been saying, is that there is likely to be some kind of potential confusion as to what we're trying to, the road which we're trying to go down. I'm very happy that we go ahead and choose a chief executive straight away and have that as the first step, as Councillor, as I think it's already been mentioned before, is that as a first step we take that to go forward, and that person then creates a new management team. An answer. Just to clarify with you, Leader, I wasn't suggesting that the council chooses the new management team. It's just the structure of the new management team is something which I think needs to be approved by us so that we feel comfortable that that's a structure we can work with as councillors. And then that would then be this, as I would see the roadmap, that would then be the third step, would then be for the new management team to start looking at identifying future changes which would bring further benefits. Trying to identify exactly what those benefits are, I don't think anybody around this table can actually identify, put a number on. The 5% which Martin Forbes was identifying is a sort of general feeling, possibly that's there. And 5% of what, 13 million, is that 650,000 a year potential? It could be more, hopefully it will not be less, like some of the comparative councils managed to achieve. But I think, it would be helpful in the debate next week and for us to be able to give our commitment to a future way forward, if that clarification of the future roadmap is made clearer than I think it is at present in the papers. I think the papers probably represent a lot of the thinking from the executive, but that's, I think there are assumptions there which possibly the rest of the council may not have fully grasped.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Follows.
Thank you. Firstly, in terms of the employment process, I absolutely agree with you. You're entirely right. As far as I'm aware, it needs to be opened up to all external parties as well, and the role profile will be important for that new role when drafted. In terms of risk, I think in terms of phase one, and please do interject if you believe I'm incorrect, but the risks of phase one, a single joint executive, are fairly low. It's actually when you get to those other shared services type bits that they'd be looking at where the risks really would need to be properly scoped and scored, I think, in serious depth. And certainly I imagine the scrutiny committee will be asking for that, and if they're not, I certainly will be. In terms of the structure that a chaired chief executive brings in, I would imagine that the joint scrutiny committee that we're proposing to oversee this partnership would be given sight of what structure they were proposing, and both Guildford and Waverley would weigh in. That's how I would foresee that working, and I imagine the exec would be weighing in as well on that. In terms of roadmap, what I was actually going to propose, because I don't like lots of words when we can avoid it. I'm going to ask officers if they can just produce a small process flow diagram just to outline the stages that we're going to, the stages that are covered at full council, and then the immediate next steps and hypothetical future steps that we can reasonably foresee as a process diagram that's on a page for everybody.
Okay. Got Councillor Hegan, then Councillor Blishen, and then Councillor Mullen, and then Councillor Hyman.
I just want to refer to the pink papers, page 42 of our pack, where it says head of paid service. One of the considerations is precisely this internal and external for the head of paid service, because I believed what Councillor Davidson has said, and you've alluded to, that we do need to advertise externally, but it seems implicit in the tranche 1 comment that it can be internal only. And I do think when we come to look at the potential costs of the allocation of the cost savings on the single chief executive, that we do have a clear understanding of that particular issue.
If I may, Chair.
The leader.
I will request from South East Employers a paragraph that just clarifies what is the process and the rules in regards to whether it needs to go outside, and if it doesn't, and why, just so that's clear for everybody from our independent HR people.
Thank you. Councillor Blishen.
Thank you, Chair. Joan's stolen a bit of my thunder. I was wondering if we should advertise this chief executive post externally as well. If we don't, I can see a problem. If we choose either ours or theirs, there's going to be some not exactly infighting, but it might not go down too well if we don't advertise this more widely. The second thing, I've got a few staff questions here which I couldn't ask before. Would you like me to do it now or later? Right.
Chairman, I'm sorry. We've been told by Louise Fleming that if we're discussing pink papers, we ought to really stop the YouTube.
We're not discussing the detail. If you go into exempt detail, then I'll have to stop the meeting. We'll have to go to exempt. But if you're keeping your questions fairly general.
They are pretty general, yes. Right, this is from Councillor Sally Dixon, actually, who sent to me. She's talking about page 32, potential partnership savings, and she said she suspects it's through a reduction in staff. These are her words, not mine. And she also notes that environmental and regulatory services are dealt in a very different way. First point, in Waverley Borough Council, most of these are outsourced, and Waverley employs 34 staff. In Guildford, these are in-house and they employ 140 staff. Her problem here is, if we rationalise these services and decide to outsource as per the Waverley model, then the axe will fall very hard on Guildford staff. That's the first one. We see in the table benefits identified. Guildford already has 2 plans to restructure staff, namely Guildford Phase B staffing, restructure and staff restructuring of strategy and comms. Her observation is that Guildford seems to have a lot of restructuring underway, whereas we haven't, and there may be some resistance to further job losses linked to any merger with Waverley. And she mentioned something we've all noticed, but the head count between the 2 councils and the predisposition to use outsourcing would point to Waverley having fewer staff to reduce at the start. And then her point is, I think we need to ring fence Waverley and not just decide on parity in job reductions where there is no parity, because Guildford provides services such as environmental and regulatory in-house and Waverley outsource it. Last comment. On page 34.4, potential partnership savings. The last line reads, we estimate the value of savings achievable from staffing as 1.384 million. Well, this number does not tally with table 11, where the number is 720k. And a final comment. While there is a great deal of detail on staff cuts, I don't see a list of properties or the potential, probably far greater, of making savings through the sale of sublettings, or for that matter, whether hot desking might become an option with an increase in home working going forwards. That's all her comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Leader or Councillor Merriweather?
In the first instance, the vast majority of that is the sort of stage 3 stuff that we're talking about here, where individual service areas would need to have business cases drafted at them. I think there's also an assumption I would just check right now that the only way to make efficiencies and savings generally is through the reduction of staff, which is not the only way for a start. I mean, there's by working together, shared procurement, shared space, that kind of stuff. There's lots of non-staff ways that they could save costs. So I would just flag that one for a start. But also, just because there is a disparity in the number of people in that part of Guildford or in this part of Waverley, because each service is quite different and sometimes their delivery in each borough is quite different. I mean, the fact that Guildford's predominantly one homogenous town centre versus Waverley's quite disparate populations, sometimes the delivery is appropriate for that borough and there's a reason for the disparity. So there won't always necessarily be a straight down the line, we've done it this way, reduced by X in Waverley, so reduce the same by X in Guildford. It's not necessarily has to be, which is also why it needs to be done on a case-by-case basis, because it's just too complicated to not do it that way. I agree with many of Sally's points, but most of them would be taken up quite some time in the future if there was a business case in those areas to justify them. But it wouldn't always be applied uniformly, and that's why it needs to be case by case.
Councillor Mulliner.
Thank you, Chairman. I think picking up the point about risk and the timetable, I think the timetable flow diagram, good to have dates on it too, so people can have some idea whether they're dealing with a 4-week process, a 4-month process, or a 4-year process. It's obviously not going to be 4 years, but I hope you get the point. I think on risk, if the stages are, first, point a joint chief executive, secondly, that person will then appoint a new management team, and then they investigate business cases, there is a clear risk that they will actually find it's very difficult to make significant savings. And therefore the risk I think we need to have in mind is what are the downsides, if any, if we have basically brought together the chief executive and senior management team, and that no other benefits can easily be found. I read the local partnerships document, and they're quite cautious about both property savings and third-party service savings, because we've already done an awful lot of that work. So it is possible, I think, it is foreseeable at least, that the business cases in stage 3 might not produce much in the way of useful savings, particularly when they're diluted by the fact that we will probably get less than half of them. So I think we then have to consider, well, how will the efficiency of either council be affected when they have half the number of people managing what is happening? I don't know the answer to that, but I would be mildly surprised if overstretching senior staff was the way to better performance, and that does worry me quite genuinely as a risk. And I agree with Councillor Davidson that having a risk matrix which actually tries to put some impact numbers, both how likely it is and how severe the impact of a risk is, will be something we should really see before we take any decisions at all. And I'm not hopeful we'll see anything like that in time. Thank you.
Just on that point, could I also add a concern on that front? If we look at the balance between Guildford Borough Council and Waverley, we find that net revenue, it's around about 60-40 or 59%, 41%, Guildford Borough Council being significantly larger. In terms of head count, 63% of the combined heads at the moment are Guildford's, 37% are Waverley's. The cumulative budget gap is 16.5 million for Guildford Borough Council by 2025-26 and 5.8 for us. So on all counts, Guildford is a larger council and appears to have a significantly larger problem. The two concerns that I would have, firstly, if we're going to have a shared management team, is Waverley going to get a sufficient share of a chief executive in that combined team when the issues and problems and size of the councils show that Guildford has something like 2/3 of the issues or 2/3 of the size or 60% somewhere around there, when ours is significantly smaller. There is a concern that I have in terms of the apportionment of time of a chief executive and the senior management team. And the other point, which also comes from that, is the level of savings that might get apportioned. I presume that any business case would, on a case-by-case basis, apportion any savings between the councils based on the exact arrangements for that particular case. There's not going to be a single algorithm which would apply. But those 2 points I would like to add to the point that Councillor Mulliner has made. Councillor Follows, do you want to reply, or do you want to bring
I'll just comment briefly, and then it would probably be a good idea to bring in Councillor Clark. Yes, in terms of trying to scope out some of that initial risk, I think some of those are quite valid, and we would need to look at that. In terms of how costs and benefits are apportioned, well, as you said, you go into each service, that doesn't necessarily always work out the same way. There is no, as you say, there's no master algorithm that allows us to work this out for the entirety of Guildford and Waverley in one go. It'd be great if there was, but there definitely isn't. So in terms of time of chief executives being spent at Guildford or Waverley, and the same with senior management, that is one of the things that the agreement needs to work out between Guildford and Waverley as a general principle, how we apportion costs, benefit and time and resources. If I could just briefly bring in Mark.
Mark?
Thank you. Yeah, just ditto to that, and also just to restate the caution about using the numbers that are in the report. We're, in many respects, we're not comparing apples with apples, for example, Guildford has more employees because it has more insourced structuring than Waverley. So, but to come back to the point, and the point is that at the moment we are commissioning the work and the investigation that will produce the answers and the guidance and the data that we need to make these decisions.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Peter Clark and just see if, Councillor Clark, do you want to add anything from your point of view on risk or any of the points that have just been made?
He's not on the call.
He's not there. Okay. in that case. That's kind of difficult. Okay, I think we've had an answer from the leader.
Councillor Gray has his hand up.
I'll come to Councillor Gray. I've got Councillor Hyman first. I'll come to Councillor Gray. And then I think with the hour of 9 o'clock approaching, I'll attempt to draw things together and come to a close. So I'm going to go to Councillor Hyman first, then Councillor Gray.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm just wondering whether we should be rewording or asking whether you, Chairman, can reach agreement at this point with the leader here and now on any rewording you might like to, or we as a group might like to have to the recommendations to clarify, because of what you've explained already during the meeting perfectly well regarding, the difficulty in fully understanding what we would be committing to with the way that the recommendation is, just tightening it up a little bit. I mean, I fully appreciate this is being done at a great pace, and I do congratulate the leader and deputy and the executive team and our officers and Councillor Merriweather, of course, particularly in the speed at which they've brought this sort of thing forward. But I think we as a group seem to be agreed that we want to ensure that we have all the information necessary before we make before we agree, before we're asked to agree to anything, and we haven't seen the information yet. There's also another issue, which is obviously there are two elements to this for both us and for Guildford, which is the saving money and there's preempting unitary bid. And those together, we have to look at it, I think, but the proposition, is it fit for purpose on both of those? We want to know, is it going to work? Is it worthwhile doing? Will it work as preempting a unitary bid? Can it? Or would we have to do it differently for it to do so, for it to be more effective in that regard? And obviously, the more money that this can save, the more likely it is to also fit that side of the bill. But in principle, one thing that I'd like to throw in as a last thought, which was my very first thought actually in this issue, was that we need to sort out our houses first, our own houses first. And I think that it's really what you said, what you've just said only a few minutes ago, that because there's a difference at the stages in making savings that Guildford and Waverley are at, should we be looking at doing this actually where our process starts, joining together starts after each of the councils have got themselves to the same place, so we're on equal terms. So Guildford have to put their savings in place, and they have to show that they're going to do what we've already been through over the past few years, and we have to make sort out our house as well. That way we're actually equals when we go into it, because at the moment that is my concern, that we don't seem to be equals. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I think in terms of the wording of the executive resolution, the whole paper talks about lots of savings, not just the appointment of a chief executive and the savings of a single management team. In the paper, particularly the one from local partnerships, we get into all sorts of third-party savings, of property savings, and so on and so forth. So you get the feeling that what we're doing here is going all the way, when in fact the resolution before us is only the appointment of a single chief executive and the single management team. I think the weight of the documents and the resolution don't quite tie up, and I think we just need to, I would have thought, tighten it in terms of the second paragraph before you get to actually the recommendation 2, where it says how any costs should be funded. First of all, we want to make sure all that data is received before we get to full council. And also, of course, that the costs that are talked about there are only in relation to the single management team and the chief executive, not to the rest of the financial benefits in which the whole paper goes into. So I think there is a slight mismatch. You may want to do that in making it clear in in the debate or in the discussion, but certainly I don't think it's as clear as it could be.
It does have to be in the wording now, doesn't it, I think, Chairman?
I think it is in the wording, but it's a bit convoluted, is what I would say. Leader, have you got any comments on that?
Well, my first comment is that it says clearly in respect of the potential financial implications of appointing a single joint chief executive in the first recommendation. So as far as I'm concerned, the scope is clear. However, if the O&S wishes to make recommendations as to any changes of wording after the meeting or separately, I'm more than happy to read them and certainly consider them if that's the case.
Well, we can't as a committee do anything afterwards. We can have individual discussions. But I think
all I'm saying is if members think there are opportunities to tidy up the wording that you don't want to sit here and wordsmith now and you want to send another point, we will obviously always listen to those if there's ways we can tighten it up. My personal opinion at present, though, is that it's quite clear. I actually do agree with you in terms of the fact that the paper does set so much of the context out that actually the recommendation is then, it's almost an anticlimax really, isn't it? Because, you know, we've sold the whole thing and then we're doing the first phase. So there's probably some introduction and some part of the wording in the report that maybe just highlights the phase that we're going to do now. Perhaps if we are having a sort of process diagram roadmap type thing to support this, we could make it very clear to use some map parlance, you are here in it, just so it's very clear for everybody.
many of us have some substantial reservations about even where we've got to here. But of course, the weight of the document goes way beyond that and is a bit out of kilter with the recommendation.
If I may, Chair, I have substantial reservations about having to do the whole process at all. Unfortunately, the government won't give us any more money, so I don't have a choice.
All right, Councillor Mullen.
Sorry, a very quick one. I should have mentioned it earlier. I just want to ask whether the intervening paragraph in the recommendation we are going to get any advice issued by the Council's Chief Financial Officer or his appointed deputy on the three topics relating to the level of approval required, how any costs will be funded, and the appropriateness of any cost-sharing agreement. I mean, the problem is that we've got no idea what the cost-sharing agreement will be at this stage. We know it's important, we know it's got to be in the inter-authority agreement, but quite when it's going to appear in this roadmap is still a mystery. But are we going to get any contribution from the Council's Chief Financial Officer on this extremely important topic?
Leader.
I'll be seeking it, but only when I've got the information from South East employers, because otherwise our Section 151 will find it quite difficult to comment.
I think, again, an observation from the chair. I mean, this is all a bit lastminute.com, and it's a fairly substantial and serious discussion and decision to take. I just, it's a pity that we haven't got more data available earlier.
If I may, Chair, it's also a pity that we have to rush to Farnham to host a full council in the scenario that we have to do it in at the present. These are all problems that exist at the moment for us all.
I think there's a difference between the location of a full council meeting and the decision of this sort that we're trying to take. Right, I'm going to go, sorry, I've got Councillor Gray next, and then I'll come to you, Councillor Hegan. So, Councillor Gray, would you like to ask your question or make your observation now?
Thank you very much for letting me come back, and I'm grateful to the leader for clarifying what his proposal is. The proposal is to appoint a chief executive, and by that appointment, we're going to save money. My concern here is that we've got two councils at the moment who are run by individuals, and we're expecting that to come together immediately and make savings. Now, to my mind, there needs to be a transition plan. That new appointment is going to need capacity to run both councils under the interim until he's got his appointed management team in place and perhaps additional resources to cover transformation of each of the councils. He's not going to have enough bandwidth to do the proposals we're suggesting. That's what my concern is. Yes, by all means, go ahead with the appointment of the chief executive, but let's have some words around how we think that is going to work in practice. And are we going to keep the current people alongside until such time as he's got a management team proposal and he's got resources in place? Or is there another solution which we haven't heard of yet? Thank you.
Thank you. Leader?
So I can answer part of that. So Firstly, when we employ a chief executive, it's obviously the highest paid officer in the council. So my expectation of a new leader from the officer side of things is that they earn their pay by managing the transition as part of the first thing they do. The other thing that I would probably want to make clear is that just because there's a new shared chief executive, it wouldn't immediately dismiss all of the current management teams of Guildford and Waverley overnight. They would still be there managing the bandwidth of the councils in their current state. I do believe that you're probably right, and certainly most of the models that we've seen and had explained to us, both from independent parties and also from our current chief executive, is that there would need to be some kind of transitionary arrangements, and as you say, to manage the actual transition and transformation process itself requires some resource. However, I don't necessarily think it's the duty of either the executive or members to presume all of that. I actually think we should appoint a new shared chief executive whose job it would be to do that and bring it to council. That's what we're proposing. From my point of view, the resolution is very clear in what it seeks to do.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hegan, and then I'm going to initiate bringing this to a close.
Thank you, Chair. Mine's really just a point of clarification on page 20 of the papers, which is setting out the vision statement. Points 41, 42, 43 talk in terms of a joint working group, but which comprises the leaders, deputy leaders and chief executives. But the joint working group reporting to joint executive on key decisions, is that something that is already in existence, going to come into existence, and for how long?
Leader.
So during the course of the discussions on this, two informal groups have effectively existed. One is the group of leaders, deputy leaders and chief executives, which has on occasion been supplemented by the Section 151 officers and the portfolio holders for finance from the two councils. The second group that has informally existed is the joint executives of both councils, who have on two occasions met to discuss vision and generally to effectively get to know each other and have the discussions that we need to do in order to sort of progress this sort of partnership further. The reasons that these have had to act informally is that until we get further down the process, and as we've stated in some of the other the context of the document and also in the briefing, the intention is to create a formal joint scrutiny body. Until we actually get further down the line, we can't create that formal body. So effectively, those working groups have effectively been the informal mechanisms to get us to the point we are before we try and do the formal processes later.
Thank you.
Okay, right. Ladies and gentlemen, we have made a number of observations. I think
Sorry, Chairman, the scrutiny officer wants to say something to you.
Okay. Scrutiny officer.
Could you speak up?
He's asking whether we want to make a specific recommendation or make some particular observations. I was going to come to that, Mark, in my summary now, and I'll come to that now. We have made a number of observations. We've had some concerns about the speed with which this is being done, some of the timetabling, some of the information which we would expect to be available now, which isn't available, some of the business case information which isn't yet available. We've expressed some reservations concerning the appointment of a new chief executive and how the time would be apportioned between those people, and we've made a series of particular points. Now, we could either rest at that point, or we could move towards an attempt to have some sort of recommendation to accept, broadly accept, or broadly to not accept the recommendation that's being made to Executive Council. What is the view of members? Councillor Mulliner.
Well, I would like to see something in the intervening paragraph. It's not just the advice from South East employers and from the councils. I beg your pardon. I'd like to see, in addition, a mention of risk analysis in the middle paragraph. It seems to me difficult to see how we could expect council to reach a decision on this fairly momentous matter without having an explicit coverage of the risks. And I'd refer in particular to the possibility that we might have a slimmed-down senior management team, but very little else to show for it, and then what might be called the bandwidth risk arises. Can this much slimmer team of senior managers manage both councils, both business as usual, and in their cost-saving endeavours? So that is a risk I think should be adverted to.
Okay, other members inclined to request that we ask something to be added in there concerning risk? Councillor Hegan?
I'm not certain that that is something I would support. I think I go back to the leader's comment that we are looking to appoint a new chief executive, and it's for him to define the roles and ensure the resources to deliver the service that needs to be delivered. If we wish to risk assess it through our scrutiny process or our audit process, then I think that's a separate issue, and I don't think it needs to be part of the resolution.
Others? Councillor Davison?
Thank you, Chair. In principle, I'm quite happy for the recommendations to go ahead and support that. I would criticise that it's slightly muddied, and as we've been discovering as we've had our debate around the last 2 hours, I agree with Councillor Hegan. I think the first step, which is to create the chief executive or support the creation of a single chief executive, as our leader has pointed out, has got virtually zero risk. That being the case, I don't think it's necessary to talk about risk at this stage. The risks come later on when we do much more substantial changes to our organisation and try to implement changes which will hopefully bring forward some financial reward.
Nicholson?
Well, thank you. I agree with Councillor Hagan and Councillor Davidson here. This is simply step one. It's a fairly basic step. We may have to look at risks later on, but I don't think we need to look at risks at this stage now.
Councillor Murray, I'm loath to bring you in when we're trying to discuss whether we have some sort of resolution or not, but one quick comment.
Very quickly, the language that we're using presumes we're taking it for granted that we're going to appoint a new CEO, and this resolution does no such thing. It talks about subject to the information that we get from South East employers. So at the moment, there's no defined proposal to do that. Perhaps one risk is that the data we get from South East employers doesn't even get us to first base.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think the concern that I have is that I am concerned at the risk of a single chief executive for two such different councils and the degree of risk between the two. I am concerned that we have not got a business case which backs up the appointment of a joint chief executive and a joint management team. We simply haven't got the data at the moment. So if the data is very crystal clear on Friday and points entirely to that being a good idea, then my view may shift. But I have significant concerns at this point, is that we can't make the decision. And I think it's difficult without further data and without an adequate business case to say whether we're in agreement or not. And so we could, Councillor Mulliner has asked for a risk element to be added. I sense that the group as a whole doesn't want to do that. Are there any other resolutions which we wish to pass, or are we content to leave the comments that we've made for the deliberation of the leader and the executive team?
Well, I'm mulling over in my mind what you've just said. I think any kind of decision which we make has an element of risk associated with it. And I think, as probably been mentioned earlier on this evening by our two members from the executive at this meeting, we've got very little choice. We've got to do something. And doing something, by its very nature, has a risk associated with it. My feeling is that the risk to go to a single chief executive is, I maintain that as a very low risk. Because it's a very simple back out. It costs, but it's a very simple back out.
Okay, any other comment? Councillor Mulliner?
What is the very simple back out?
Put your microphone on.
Sorry, I am confused. When you say there's a very simple back out, if you take the decision and for some reason it doesn't work, what happens then?
You reverse it. You go back to the two chief executives which we had before. Maybe not the same ones because they may have got employment elsewhere, but we go back to the situation where we had two separate CEOs.
If I may, there's actually plenty of examples of this in the local government sphere as well, where councils have undone this.
Okay, Leader, thank you. Councillor Hyman?
Well, exactly the point. I mean, if we are going to be spending money, spending time and money, and it's our residents' time and money, not ours, we haven't got any, it's all theirs, then we want to make sure that actually, if we are going to have the option of going back to where we are at present, if it is a mistake, as others have made, have decided, elsewhere have decided, yes, it was a mistake, and they'll go back to their old system. Whereabouts is the cut-off? I mean, at what point, what sort of criteria are there by which we would determine that something is a mistake? Because, we do have to approach this professionally. We have to make sure that we're not just making it up as we go along. We're doing this for our residents, and they want to know that we've thought about the things in advance and that we do have criteria which we will stand by and that we've got standards that we will stand by. But to any resident, the obvious thing is if you've got two chief executives at the moment and you're saying that one can do that job, hey, why don't you just pay each of them half as much money if they've got time to do something else at the same time? It's not a stupid point for a resident to make, actually.
Okay, I think we've got your point. Paul, I'm very loath to bring you in at this point. Okay.
So in terms of when is the out, from my point of view, it would be if it's demonstrably not working in terms of the amount of time they're spending at each council, or they are too stretched thin, it would then need to come back for some kind of review. The employment law governs quite a lot of this as well. The other thing I would just flag is that every example I've seen where this decision was undone, it was not undone for cost or benefit reasons, it was undone for political reasons where the councils fell out. So for me, the largest risk of stage one is political fallout with the other council, and that's one of the reasons why I've been so keen for the executives to work together in the way that they have, so we could, get to know each other. Frankly, there've been far too many horrendous marriage metaphors made, but that to me is the political risk, not a cost risk. I really don't see a lot of risk at all, actually, in stage one, as Councillor Davison has indicated.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, do you want to try and come to some sort of resolution, or are you content to leave the discussions that we've had on the table so that the leader, the portfolio holder and the executive can take account of those discussions?
Chairman, I was only thinking, if you don't mind me interrupting, only thinking that if we're going to go to a council meeting where people are going to have exactly the same preconceptions from the recommendation that some of us have had here, and if we're going to spend an hour or 2 hours debating exactly the same points, perhaps we could avoid that by making sure that it's absolutely clear to all. And bear in mind, we are all bears of very little brain, us councillors. We're here because we're too sick to do something else.
Okay, I'm sure that the leader and the portfolio holder will take note of the fact of the confusion that we had and perhaps map it out beforehand. Councillor Blisham?
Just a point, having listened to this evening's discussion, we seem to be veering towards option B, don't we? Thank you.
Not quite, as you've not asked what you want.
Ladies and gentlemen, I suspect that we're not going to come to a resolution. I think most of you will have broad agreement towards, in principle, going in the direction that is being proposed, but we have concerns as to the data and the business case and the timetable and the speed with which this is being done. Would that be a fair representation of where we are? Well, I mean, I would hate to try and just simply say it's a yes or a no, and I don't think that anybody would reasonably expect us to do that. We've expressed some reservations, some of us more strongly than others, but with the speed, and I think there is some clarification. If you don't want to change the actual executive resolution, of course it'd be very difficult because you have to go back to the executive and ask them to change it. But I think there is some substantial clarification that is required in order for people to understand. You could see the confusion that many of us, I think, had, and I think we would urge you to be very clear in the way in which you describe that to full council. And of course, we are still awaiting greater detail. I think that that's as far as we're going to go. Does anybody wish me to pursue it further, or does anybody else want to say anything further amongst the membership of the committee?
Well, I sense that the leader has been making copious notes about the comments and suggestions which we have been making around this debate, and I would hope that he will reflect some of this in the way it's presented on the 6th.
To confirm, I have a meeting with the Chief Executive to go through the comments that have been raised here tomorrow afternoon with the Monitoring Officer too.
Thank you. Item 7, to exclude the press and public, we don't need to do. Any other serious issues to be considered in an exempt session when that doesn't apply? I think on that I will draw this meeting to a close and thank the members for their attendance, thank officers in their absence for attending, our officers who are here for attending, thank you, and thank you to the leader and to Councillor Mark Merriweather for attending as well. Thank you.